Our next constitutional crisis is also going to be in our third category. So we're going to skip forward decades and decades to the New Deal era, when in 1936, after an overwhelming re-election, Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to try to make the Supreme Court a rubber stamp institution for his agenda. And it's not pretty, but I actually think it's a hopeful moment for the country when everyone bands together to tell FDR to buzz off, buddy. Let me clear the board, and then we'll explore the court-packing constitutional crisis of 1936. Okay, so I had to make a cut because my phone got full of video. I had to put yesterday's recordings on the computer and then delete them off the phone to make space. This video is going to be my longest ever. Things might get a little crazy. March 4th, 1933, FDR takes office, and he comes on the heels of Herbert Hoover, who is perceived to have done nothing during the Depression. Up until that point, Herbert Hoover, who's going to make his money as an engineer, become one of the richest men to ever hold the office. Up until that point, the richest man to ever hold the office of president, is going to leave the office perceived as an elite without a heart. Now, I think before my phone cut me off, I did say that Hoover tried to do some things at the federal level to help people, but it was not felt to the extent that would guarantee him re-election. FDR rolls into office. By the way, is also a rich patrician, old wealth. He's the cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. And he's going to say in his inaugural address, the nation asks for action, and action now. And he is going to roll into town with a big Democratic majority in the House and the Senate, and he is going to bring about a new deal of energy and arguably a lot of chaos. Relief, reform, and recovery are the 3 R's of the New Deal. To be totally honest, I don't know if that was something coined at the time or if that's something that history teachers have just decided to use since then. Somebody in the comments can let me know. This means that there were laws that were attempting to regulate industry, interstate commerce, wages. There were laws attempting to stimulate the economy by doing public works. There were laws that were attempting to stabilize the banking industry. Some of them would have an impact decades and decades later, like the 1933 Financial Banking Act, I believe it was called. It would come to be called shorthand Glass-Steagall, the names of its primary authors and sponsors. Then we get these acronym organizations: the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act that's going to create the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. We get the Civilian Conservation Corps. We get the Tennessee Valley Authority. We get the Fraser-Lemke Banking Reform Act. We get the Guffey Coal Act, which is not about coal in and of itself, but about labor relations within the coal industry. We get the Railroad Retirement Administration, or Railroad Retirement Act, that then creates, I guess they don't create a Railroad Retirement Administration, but what they do is they say that there is actually compulsory retirement age and pension program for rail workers of the railroad. And of course, railroads go across interstates, right? They go not just intrastate of one state, but interstates of the Union. Therefore, Congress should have the power to regulate such a commerce, right? Well, the Supreme Court is going to begin to push back against FDR. And if I get any legal descriptions wrong as I go through some of these cases, please let me know. I did not go to law school, and I only took one con law course in undergrad. Everything else is amateur, though I do take my work seriously, have a graduate degree in a mix of public policy and political communication. I'm not just trying to throw my credentials at you, only to say that I am an honest attemptor at educating, and I am not attempting to present myself as a lawyer, though that's just the sort of thing a lawyer would say to get off the hook for the things that they say and not be accountable. When I was in undergrad, however, con law class I took with a gentleman named Paul Kins. Actually, it was really interesting. He was working on Guantanamo cases at the time or at least he was working with people who were working on Guantanamo Bay cases when I was taking his class at Texas State University. And actually, this book it was from the University of Kansas Press, but it labels him as a professor at Southwest Texas State University. So this book was published before I attended it, for the first time at least. For the first publishing, that is. And this is a book called Lochner v. New York. It was actually about a case in 1905 from a law passed in New York at the state level, if I'm not mistaken. It was passed at the state level in New York and regulated the baking industry, or the bakeries in New York. Let me see if I can hold up a picture there. Yeah. So the cover art's got like a picture of some people working at the most miserable looking bakery I've ever seen. And it was pretty miserable. The reason the law passed in the Gilded Age, right, entering the progressive era, the era in which FDR's cousin, actually Teddy Roosevelt's going to be president of the United States. The reason is because even in something as seemingly chill as baking bread, work conditions really were terrible. People were working 60, 70 hours a week at bakeries, 7 days a week. And so a law was passed in New York that said, no, workers in bakeries are limited to 60 hours a week, 6 days per week out of 7. Very minimal protections for workers. And the Supreme Court, who heard a case that was obviously adjudicated all the way up the chain, eventually said no, that is a violation, I believe, of the Fifth Amendment. And what they found in the Fifth Amendment's due process clause is that workers had a freedom of contract. That is to say, if workers want to contract for 100 hours a week for 1 cent an hour, go for it, champ. The federal government has no authority to intervene. And furthermore, I think that's the logic there. With labor relations acts in the New Deal, the Supreme Court's going to add on that Congress can't, certain things are not interstate commerce, even though Congress has tried to regulate interstate commerce. Okay, I'm rambling a little bit. Lawyers, con law people, correct me down in the comments. The point here the reason I'm belaboring all this is because all of these New Deal programs, while very interesting of their own accord, all these alphabet soup acronyms should be learned about. The reason I'm bringing them all up is because a lot of these are going to get attacked by the Supreme Court of the United States, and that's going to not be the constitutional crisis, but it is going to provoke FDR to cause the constitutional crisis. What do I mean? Let's talk about the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, which involved lots of different things, but there are 2 cases that make it up to the Supreme Court contesting provisions in this law. There is a hot oil case in which the Supreme Court says that Congress delegated legislative power to the president for rulemaking that they could not have done. There is the quote-unquote sick chicken case, which is the reason they call that is because it was Schechter Poultry Corp versus the U.S. Basically, a small state chicken operation was prosecuted under provisions in the NRIA dealing with interstate commerce, and the court said this small mom and pop thing, that's not interstate commerce, that's local production. Congress can't regulate it. So they said it violated the non-delegation and it was not interstate commerce. AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, was an attempt by the government to subsidize farmers to not grow certain things, to either buy up cattle or in cases to convince farmers not to grow crops. That was because there was an overproduction problem, pushing down prices and thus putting farms out of business. And the idea, of course, was that if we reduce a supply, then prices will rise and farms will be more solvent. I'm sure that will have no unintended consequences, telling farmers not to grow food. What could possibly go wrong? Fraser-Limke was another farm bill. The idea was to slow down the repossession process. The Supreme Court is also going to strike this down because they're going to say that it is functionally a confiscation of property of banks to delay repossession without due process, and therefore that's not allowed. The Agricultural Adjustment Act is also going to be struck down because it is a part under the 10th Amendment delegated to the states, so you can't do that. Sorry, I'm grabbing. Hold on, make a cut. I got like multiple master lists about New Deal programs and like the courts because it's been a while. The Guffey-Coal Act was an attempt to regulate labor relations within the coal industry, and the Supreme Court said, just like in Lochner versus New York, no, you can't You can't violate freedom of contract there. And the Supreme Court even knocked down minimum wage laws at the state level from New York for women in June 1936. And they said, no, that violates the 15th, 14th Amendment's right to due process and to freedom of contract. So the Supreme Court is attacking lots of New Deal programs. A very famous case as well that took place and was released on Black Monday in May 1935 was what came to be known as Black Monday 1935 by New Dealers in the Roosevelt administration, among other things that were knocked down on that day, like the NIRA, like the Fraser-Limke Act, and like the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Another thing that was knocked down was not a law as insomuch as it was a put down of FDR overexerting executive power. FDR wanted to fire a man at the FTC, one of its commissioners at an independent agency, the Federal Trade Commission, a man named Humphrey. Humphrey. And there's a famous Supreme Court case called Humphrey's Executor, because Humphrey was basically fired by FDR. And then there was a suit raised that FDR did not have the power to remove that independent commissioner. And Humphrey died in the meantime, making it a bit of a moot point, except then the court took that case. Humphrey's executor, aka is like the legal executor of his will versus the United States, and the Supreme Court said that Roosevelt had acted improperly in firing that FTC commissioner for not going along with his agenda. Thus creating a wrinkle in the legal tradition that said that someone like Andrew Johnson, for example, when he fired people in his administration that were cabinet officials, there was an attempt to actually impeach him for doing things like that, and he was almost removed. But there was a sense that the president should be able to fire people within the executive branch. But how far does that go? Humphrey's executor said that at independent agencies where the Congress has said you can only, Mr. President, fire someone for cause or for malfeasance, you can't just remove people because they don't go along with your political agenda. And that has stood for about 90 years. And at the time of recording, that probably is about to at least be in part reduced down by the Supreme Court, who's going to say that actually unitary executive theory applies in some way, shape, or form, perhaps limited, to allow a president to behave as FDR did. And it's a little ironic that the conservative court is going to come to the conclusion that they want a presidency that looks more like the New Deal Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, I'm sure that they would argue that it's not about wanting results, it's about following the law, but whatever. I digress and make things presentist. Google it. Humphrey's Executor. I think it's Humphrey's Executor. For some reason, my brain is like mixing up Humphrey with Lyndon Johnson's vice president and the guy who lost to Nixon in 1968. But I think they were both named Humphrey. Okay. Someone in the comments can correct me. I'm losing my mind. I've been going for quite a long time. I apologize. The Supreme Court knocked down a bunch of New Deal legislation. They knocked down even minimum wage laws in New York that have nothing to do with FDR. The four horsemen of the Supreme Court, as they come to be called, become these boogeyman in FDR's White House. James McReynolds, Pierce Butler, Willis Von Devanter, and George Sutherland. They are generally joined by a fifth justice at the minimum, named Owen Roberts, but often also Charles Evans Hughes, the Chief Justice, in pushing down New Deal legislation. FDR, however, in 1936, is reelected. And not just reelected by a little bit, but reelected by a lot. And he gives his second inaugural address. And this time he's a little bit more explicit about what the people expect him to do. He's just won a landslide election. After the Supreme Court knocked down a bunch of his legislation, maybe the Supreme Court should act differently. And he says in his second inaugural address that it is his role to promote the general welfare. And he's going to use metaphors in the future about how the three branches of governments are three horses pulling a chariot. So presumably he also thinks it's the role of the court to promote the general welfare. They might agree, but they might not agree with why or how they might go about promoting the general welfare as FDR envisions it. And he's going to call out the court obliquely. And eventually these are going to become explicit call-outs of the court. But for now, in his second inaugural, he talks about people with dulled conscience, irresponsibility, and ruthless self-interest. that are already reappearing as he, the brave FDR, who's just won 46 states in the election, tries to fight the material suffering on the ground. And this is actually an inaugural address held on January 20th. I think this is the first time. Someone can fact check me that the inauguration is held on January 20th instead of March 4th. And it is a month later than in February 5th, well, a few weeks later, that FDR unveils his plan to take on the Supreme Court directly. This is known as the famous court packing plan. So I'm going to make a cut, open my marker, and tell you what the court packing plan was. Now, did FDR call it a court packing plan? No. In fact, he's going to fight that terminology in a fireside chat that we'll talk about. But the plan is this. FDR says, and this is real, he says, man, don't the justices seem tired? Okay, David Tennant, whatever, bruh. He's like, don't all these justices seem a little old to you? What if we said that every justice with a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court who is over 70 years old, we're not going to force them to retire, but what we are going to do is we're going to pass a law, and my New Deal Congress is going to pass it for me. I haven't consulted them on this, but I'm sure that nothing's going to go wrong with my plan. I'm riding high. This is what the Congress is going to do for me. They're going to pass a law that says for every justice on the Supreme Court over 70 years old, I can appoint a new justice to the Supreme Court, up to 15 Supreme Court justices. And at the time, this would have meant that FDR got to appoint 6 new justices, bringing the total from 9 to 15 on the Supreme Court. Lo and behold, that would have obviously created a majority for Roosevelt's New Deal program, but that's not what the intention was, right? The intention of Roosevelt that he said, that he claimed, was that, oh man, don't they seem a little tired? Don't these elderly Supreme Court justices seem like they're behind? Doesn't it seem like our judicial system could use an infusion of energy? We can relieve these poor burdened Supreme Court justices of their need to serve lifetime appointments by simply packing the court so that we have young, fresh faces to carry about the business of the judiciary. Nothing cynical going on here. FDR called in some of his members of the cabinet, called in his vice president that morning, called in a few members of Congress, and basically told them that this was his plan. And people were like, what? Because FDR is perhaps acting in a Wilsonian way. Wilson wrote a whole series of things while he was studying at Princeton on constitutional government, and wanted the executive branch to be the driver of the government, wanted the president of the United States to represent people against the interests of the special elites and to push the legislature further and further, to act more like a prime minister than a president simply receiving orders from the Congress. It sounds a little bit like Andrew Jackson, right? Andrew Jackson would have said the Congress and the president have their own opinions and should fight for them. Andrew Jackson probably would not have said that the Congress should be run or driven, like whipped sort of by the president like a prime minister, but the spirit of these two Southerners, Woodrow Wilson, who served as president during World War I in the 19-teens, in the progressive era, and Andrew Jackson would have aligned a little bit on the point of the president standing for the people democratically against the special interests. FDR, in presenting a fait accompli, what he thinks is a fait accompli is pretentious for done deal, to the Congress and the cabinet and his vice president, and saying, you guys are going to pass this court packing law for me, get on with it, was emulating this Woodrow Wilson vision of what the president should be, this progressive vision of the presidency, whipping up the Congress and telling them to get things done. And why wouldn't he think that that would be the case? For his first term, they all rubber stamped everything he asked for, sent him things he didn't ask for, really supported him, and he's been reelected with 46 states. Why wouldn't they pack the court on his behalf? Why wouldn't they pass a law saying, sure, you can have 6 more Supreme Court justices? Well, the reason is because even for his Democratic allies, this is going to look like a naked power grab, and it is very quickly going to be labeled as a court packing scheme. Now, not long after, on March 1st, there is a passage of an act that allows justices of the Supreme Court to retire with full pay and benefits. There was a sense that some of the older members of the court were holding on for dear life because they would be destitute without their job on the judiciary. So really, one of the impetus is of the court packing plan that, aren't they just old, is pulled out from Roosevelt pretty quickly. But by March 9th, so we're talking about 8 days after this particular law was passed, there was also a fireside chat that FDR gave to address concerns that had been percolating to him since he announced his plan in February, that he was just trying to pack the court. No. My cynical BS excuse of the justices just being old was the sincere motivation. I'm not motivated by trying to just ram through and have a rubber stamp Supreme Court that won't overturn my laws. And so he gives a fireside chat. I want to read to you a little bit of it on March 9th, 1937. This is FDR talking. There's a recording of this, but I'm going to read it because, good Lord, we don't need to listen to FDR talk very slowly on the radio. If by that phrase, packing the court, it is charged that I wish to place on the bench spineless puppets who would disregard the law. Let me just say this: no president fit for this office would appoint, and no senate of honorable men fit for their office would confirm that kind of appointee. So FDR is being like, pack the court. That would be below me. That'd be below the Congress. No one would do such a thing. No, we wouldn't pack the court just to have a bunch of puppets. No. We'd never do that. But he does go on to say what we do want in these new Supreme Court justices. Remember, originally he said, we want young people to help with the court. But then, in this fireside chat, the mask comes off. He says, what we really want from justices is ones who understand these modern conditions. What does that mean? Well, it means we want justices that are going to be puppets and not overthrow the New Deal. So he's like, we don't want spineless puppets. We want ones that are spineless puppets. Okay, Mr. Roosevelt, sounds bad. And he actually tries to turn the tables. He says people who say this is a dangerous precedent, this court packing, no. They're the ones setting a dangerous precedent. He says, quote, it's a dangerous precedent because Congress always has had and always will have that power, aka the power to put more justices on the Supreme Court. And that's technically maybe true. We've never faced a crisis where the Congress has tried to pack the court and then the Supreme Court has resisted that. We haven't seen that before. It's possible under the powers of like Marbury versus Madison that the court would find such a law unconstitutional, but we've never gotten that far before. What we've had are little administrative nibble fights throughout American history where, Congress does set the number of Supreme Court justices. The Judiciary Act of 1869 was the most recent before this, I believe, which set the number of justices at 9. It's a traditional number, and it's already quite a few. I mean, if you really think about efficiency, what's more efficient? Having a 3-panel judge where it's a 2-to-1 decision, a 9 where you need 5-to-4 and you have 9 different voices, or is 15 really more efficient where you have 15 Supreme Court justices packed in with their law clerks making opinions? Which one of those is really more efficient, right? And the Congress, though, has sought the right number over time. We talked about the 1800 election earlier. There was a nibbling around that time by Adams and the Federalists that had reduced the number. And then in the Jefferson administration, this gets restored to 6 justices of the Supreme Court and a new circuit judge. Andrew Jackson has the court expanded, but it actually is because of workload. I think someone can fact check me there, but it's not because Andrew Jackson wanted necessarily opinions of the Supreme Court to go his way. He was very famous for ignoring them anyway. Lincoln added a 10th during the Civil War, and then Grant and Congress restores that to 9. After the reduction under Andrew Johnson. So there is a little bit of politicking going on, but there is never anything like this. 6 expanded all of a sudden. No. That is unprecedented. And I forgot to mention that FDR, the reason I brought up the case of Adams, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, and Grant and the nibbling around is because FDR raises it in his speech in his fireside chat on March 9th, 1937. He says, it's not, somebody's got to set the number. Congress sets the number. It'd be a dangerous precedent to say Congress can't set the number. My court packing plan is not a court packing plan. We have to save the Constitution from the court and the court from itself. We are a government of laws, not of men. He's using a lot of language here that sounds good on its face, prima facie, but we all know deep down what FDR is trying to do. And to the nation's credit, and even to the credit of his allies, they don't really buy it either. On March 22nd, 1937, a letter from the Chief Justice makes it to the Senate Judiciary Committee from Chief Justice Hughes, who says, first of all, more judges, more problems. That's a direct quote. I didn't make that up. More judges, more problems. Spelled M-O, judges, M-O, problems. That's a joke. Did you laugh? Come on. It's only been like 20 hours of talking, 15 hours, 4 hours. I don't know how the edit is. Why isn't that funny to you? Haven't I made jokes up to now? Come on now. Okay, here's an actual quote from the Chief Justice. The court is, quote, fully abreast of its work. So the claim that FDR made months ago that we're all just old and behind, that's not even true. And then something else happens. The court starts to reverse its behavior. And by the court, I mean one single justice, Owen Roberts, who's generally been joining up with the four horsemen, right, to create a 5-4 majority, often more than that, but at the bare minimum 5-4 majority to overturn New Deal laws. He flips. And he starts to actually support New Deal legislation that he previously opposed in very suspicious ways. For example, there is a minimum wage law that he upholds. There's a minimum wage law on March 29th, 1937, Washington minimum wage law, Washington state, for women. You'd think that the Supreme Court would just overturn this in the same way they overturned the New York state minimum wage for women. But, oh no. Owen Roberts changes his mind, and he starts to say Congress can regulate commerce in Article 1, Section 8 powers. Fed control in labor and industry, the Commerce Clause, it works. You can do that. The Wagner Act that created the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, is upheld. The Social Security Act is upheld. And Justice Von Devanter, one of the four horsemen, actually, who's extremely old. He's the first to actually go in May of 1937. And I want to say he's in his 80s. Hold on. I'm going to make a cut and double check how old this guy was. He was 78 years old. Okay. So he resigns. So some people will call Owen Roberts' flip the flip in time that saved 9. That's like the nice little phrase for this period of time. And there's a debate about whether Justice Roberts, was sincere in his change of heart about the Commerce Clause, or whether he was just trying to save the court from the court packing. I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that there was a switch in time, and it might have saved 9 because the Congress changed its mind. It did not save 9, as in the 9 members of the court, because FDR changed his mind with these developments. No. FDR is going to show some of his stubbornness here, some of his intransigence, some of his egomania. I hate to be that harsh on a president, but I think there is a sense Stephen Knott, who wrote a book called The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, and my good friend, Dr. Joseph Hall Patton, goes by the name Cynical Historian. Here there's a lot of people who've done a lot of work to raise the fact that Woodrow Wilson was a monstrous person and a bad president, even though for a long time he had been held up as one of the best presidents by historians, mostly because of his action, presumably in World War I. FDR is to this day held up pretty high in esteem, and part of that is because he was seen as the president who led us through World War II and through the Great Depression. And I think that there probably should be another reassessment of FDR's time. In the same way that we judge LBJ for Vietnam, despite the fact that the Great Society should have been his legacy if he hadn't become such a strange actor on Vietnam, FDR, I think, should also be reassessed because of this court packing stuff, because of just his general desire to become clearly a destructor of the Article 3 powers of the judiciary, to make them, yes, a rubber stamp. A puppet branch of government. This was a constitutional crisis. This was the third type that we talked about, where one branch is trying to usurp another branch, trying to make it basically irrelevant, and trying to make the court not a reviewer of laws. In fact, even after all this controversy is over, we're skipping ahead a little bit, but in 1937, September 17th, on the 150th Constitution Day, aka the day that like celebrated the birth of the American Constitution at the convention, FDR in a speech says, "The Constitution says nothing about power of court to declare legislation unconstitutional, nor does it mention the number of justices." So he's basically saying Marbury versus Madison, that ain't real. Nothing in the Constitution about that, which is true, technically. And the Constitution doesn't say anything about the number of judges. Again, true to the letter of the Constitution. But just as Abraham Lincoln's actions in the Civil War might be construed as constitutional, even though they were against the spirit, as in the spirit of the Constitution, even though they were against the letter of the Constitution, we might say FDR's actions, though they don't find opposition in the letter of the Constitution, are absolutely opposed in the spirit of the Constitution. FDR still wants the court packing, even though the flip has happened, even though one of the four horsemen of the Supreme Court who's been opposing his work has retired, even though FDR is going to go on to appoint Hugo Black, Stanley Reed, Felix Frankfurter, William O. Douglas, Frank Murphy, Jimmy Burns, and Robert H. Jackson. Robert H. Jackson being the one that we mentioned earlier, the contemporary imponderables, one of the most fascinating people in American history that you might not have heard of. Google that man. He was at the Nuremberg trials. His concurring opinion in the Steele case is more influential than the actual majority opinion. I think he gives us an immensely useful framework for looking at executive uses of power, but that's beyond the bounds of this particular conversation. What is Congress doing in this period of time? Because Roosevelt still wants to pack the court. He still wants his thing packed. Well, first the Congress tries to compromise a little bit behind the scenes with the president. They're like, okay, well, what if you could only do one per year? What if the forced retirement was at 75 years of age? What if this? What if that? Could we nibble away some of this court packing? But in the end, FDR stands firm. And so the Senate Judiciary Committee puts out a report. 7 of the 10 signers of this report are of FDR's own party. And this report says that the court packing is needless, futile, and utterly dangerous abandonment of constitutional principle. Utterly dangerous abandonment of constitutional principle. That's not actually the strongest line in this report. The strongest line, in my opinion, is it should be so emphatically rejected that its parallel will never again be presented. We should shoot this down so hard, this court packing plan. This is the president's own party. We should shoot this down so hard, no one in the future will ever even bother to try. Pretty strong language. FDR, this is what's so nuts. He's like, you know what you guys need? You guys need a beach vacation with me to hammer this out. Let's have some drinks. Being serious. So this put down from his own party. It doesn't compute. You're not clocking this, FDR. There's a June 1937 Jefferson Island retreat with 407 Democratic congressmen in the Chesapeake Bay. Please, please guys, what if we hang out in the Chesapeake and you guys all change your mind on how tyrannical I'm being? It doesn't work. Okay. This stuff actually does make it to the floor of the Senate, and there is an advocate, the Senate Majority Leader, Joseph Robinson of Arkansas, who takes up in July 1937. I haven't been writing much on the board. Well, whatever. We're not going to write it down. We're 17 billion hours in. You get it. In July of 1937, the court packing plan is on the floor of the Senate, Senator Robinson is arguing for the bill. He gives a 2-hour speech. It's swelteringly hot. It's July. Everyone in the Senate is old. Robinson thinks I'm going to wear them down. If I just argue with everyone, if I'm just fiery, they'll just bend to my will. And after a day of debating, Robinson goes home. And this is true. He drops dead. He is found with his spectacles to the side and his papers for like the issue of the court packing in the Congress, the congressional record in his hand. So the chief advocate, the chief defender of the court packing plan drops dead July 14th, 1914, and July 22nd, did I say 1914, 1930? Well, July 22nd, 1937, the Senate, by a vote of 70-20, refers the legislation on court packing back to the Judiciary Committee. That is a Robert's Rules of Order way of saying, F you, FDR, your bill ain't good enough. We're basically we're tabling it. It's going back to committee. It'll never be seen in the light of day again. The court packing plan is dead. As we discussed, though, after this in September, FDR is still going to be on Constitution Day, no other, going to be arguing for the court packing plan and throwing shade at the Supreme Court, even though he is going to shape the court by appointing 8 justices of the Supreme Court. There's 9. He's going to appoint 8. Maybe he appoints one in his last term. Whatever. He appoints a lot. He appoints a lot of justices.